The White House is keeping a close eye on Ukraine as about 100,000 Russian troops sit at Russia's border with Ukraine. And while diplomacy is the preferred solution, President Biden today spoke in plain language on the consequences Russia would face if Vladimir Putin were to direct a move on Ukraine.
If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion. But it will be met with severe and coordinated economic response that I've discussed in detail with our allies, as well as laid out very clearly for President Putin. But there is no doubt, let there be no doubt at all, that if Putin makes this choice, Russia will pay a heavy price.
All right, so given Biden's remarks, we also want to talk about what Russia's strategy is here and what might play out if Russian forces do cross the Ukrainian border. So joining us to discuss is Melinda Haring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda, welcome to Quick Take. You obviously just heard this conversation with President Biden saying that Russia will pay a heavy price. Do you think his remarks made things worse?
No, I think that the Kremlin's just going to shrug its shoulders. President Biden has made a lot of statements. He told the Kremlin that he will do three things if they invade Ukraine again. You will see the meanest, nastiest package of sanctions that we've ever thrown at you. You will see more defensive material in Ukraine, and you will see more NATO troops in Eastern Europe. So I don't think this is anything new. He's using, he's trying to scare Putin. The question is, has he? Does Moscow fear this package of sanctions? I don't know that it does.
Did he misspeak, though? Because the White House is trying to walk things back a little bit here.
Joe Biden really screwed up last night. He made a statement and he took off his presidential hat and he put on his think tank cap. He was trying to do my job. He was trying to analyze the situation, and he made a number of screw ups. He said he thinks that Putin is going to go in. He said that there's different scenarios. He said that there would be different responses. He talked about differences between the allies. This is no, 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 no. The White House immediately tried to step it back and issue, a regular talking points that you would expect the White House to issue, that we have Ukraine's back, that our position hasn't changed. But, saying he basically ceded the initiative to Putin and said that the ball is in your court. And that's a really dangerous place to be in. But it's not game over, Scarlett. There's a chance that the White House could pull back that initiative if they do something really smart. What do they need to do? They need to push NATO to put troops in Eastern Europe right now before Vladimir Putin does anything more serious, and then also to keep sending defensive material to Ukraine now. That's what would convince Putin that the U.S. is serious about deterrence.
What do you think the likelihood is of the U.S. successfully pushing NATO on getting troops on the ground there, given that the U.S. has said we won't be sending troops ourselves?
I think NATO's open to it. There's discussions right now that are underway, and I think it's a real possibility if the White House stands up and shows leadership on this issue today.
One thing about this whole situation is we've been here before. It's been a while, right? Because Russian troops have been gathering at the Ukraine border since November. Why is the U.S., why is the Ukraine so convinced that Putin will be moving the troops across the border by late January, early February, when they could stay there indefinitely?
They can't stay there indefinitely. That's one problem that I'd like to correct. So in order to keep these troops there, it takes a lot of money and material, and they can't stay at these temporary bases, forever and ever. There's a limited time window. The weather is not on Putin's side. It has been a mild winter, and if he wants to do a full land scale invasion, he needs the mud to freeze so that the tanks can roll in. But you know what? I just got off the phone with some folks in Kiev, and they've said that you all in Washington need to calm down. Vladimir Putin is not doing a land invasion anytime soon. The latest number from Ukraine, my Ukrainian defense people say that there are 120,000 to 140,000 Russian troops, and they're in the north, they're in the east, and they're in the south. So they surround Ukraine by three sides. But if you wanted to do a full-scale land invasion, you would need at least 200,000 troops, but 300,000 would be more preferable. And the Russians aren't doing the things that you would need to do. They aren't putting the logistics staff in place right now if they were planning a full-scale land invasion. So he also said, watch the movement of people and watch the movement of fuel. These are two things that military analysts will be watching in the weeks to come.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting that they said that you guys are misunderstanding a lot of this. What else are we misunderstanding in the U.S. when it comes to Putin's intentions and how things appear?
So I think we underestimate him. At first, I thought that this conflict was all about Ukraine. I thought Vladimir Putin wants to destroy the Western project, but this is about much more than Ukraine. Ukraine is a lever. Putin wants to destroy NATO. He wants to make the West look weak, and he wants to rewrite the rules of the European security architecture. So when we want to just sort of ignore this problem and go back to trying to fix COVID or thinking about climate change or some of the other administration's priorities, we can't. Vladimir Putin is not going away. Even if we want to ignore him, he is super ambitious and he's not going to be satisfied, even if he gets what he wants in Ukraine.
Given that, what would you say is the role of the rest of Europe here?
Europe needs to step up. That's the issue. The Germans have refused to sell weapons to Ukraine. Knock it off. It's obvious that the Ukrainians need weapons and they need support. Europe needs to speak in a unified voice. It needs to send as much material as it can, and it needs to maintain its unity. That's the really crucial point right now. And it can't sell Ukraine out. It cannot engage in any kind of deal that we will protect our security in place of Ukraine. That's what Russia wants. Russia wants Europe to trade Ukraine away. That is a no-go.
It very much feels like a chess match between Joe Biden, who often misspeaks on this, as we've seen, and Vladimir Putin, who you've just mentioned we tend to underestimate. We know that a bipartisan delegation of senators traveled to Ukraine over the weekend to try to reassure Kiev that the U.S. stood by and stood with them. Is there a role for other groups to play here, or does it really come down to how Biden and Putin decide on their next step?
That's a great question. So Vladimir Putin wants to narrow the negotiating table. He wants the table to be Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. But Biden was smart last week. He kept expanding it. So we had the OSCE, we had NATO involved. You can't decide Ukraine's future without Europe and without the Ukrainians. And that's a point the White House has been really, really consistent on. And I would applaud them for that.
I'm a little curious as well just about the individuals living in Ukraine. Melinda, how concerned are you for them? Do you see this becoming, a situation like anything else that we've seen the Biden administration handling in terms of foreign policy efforts to help other nations handle human rights abuses if things get to that point?
So the mood in Kiev is very different than it is in Washington. I live in Washington, and it's Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine all the time right now. It's the biggest crisis. And I think the White House deserves credit for getting Europe and Ukraine, waking everyone up and saying, guys, this is really a big crisis. It could spiral into a world war. And I'm saying that without exaggeration. It really could. But Ukrainians feel differently. I have a stringer in Kiev now, and he just wrote a wonderful piece for the Atlantic Council website. His name is Vladislav Davidison, and he says that people either don't want to talk about it, hey, we've been at war for 8 years, nothing new, or they have a sense of fatalism. If Russia's going to attack, it's going to attack. So the mood in Kiev is really one that I certainly didn't expect. It's a mix of denial and fatalism.
That is so interesting. I go back to what Maddie had said earlier, which is the U.S. made clear that U.S. troops would not be called in. But do you see any scenario, Melinda, in which the U.S. military might be called in to take on what's happening in the Ukraine and with Russia?
I don't think that Joe Biden can afford politically to send troops there. And he said it's no way. But there are other things that we could do. We can send more trainers. We can send more ships. There's a number of things that we could do to bolster Ukraine and to show that we're serious about deterrence, short of sending boots on the ground.
Linda, final question for you. You mentioned that you're in Washington and that this is the topic of the hour, of the day, long term. Do you think that this is going to be domestically a voting issue, an at the ballot issue, a kitchen table issue for voters? And is that perhaps why Biden is pushing it so much right now?
Yes and no. So this is an election year, and Joe Biden's numbers are sliding, right? And he had a big screw up in Afghanistan. He cannot afford another major foreign policy blunder. Remember, Joe Biden was Mr. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has a lot of expertise on foreign policy, so he really can't afford another screw up. And COVID hasn't gone well, and the economy hasn't turned around. So, he's got to get this one right. And he also has a personal stake in Ukraine. You have to remember this. When he was vice president, he was negotiating. He was going back and forth all the time. He really, really cares about how things land in Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to succeed. So I think he has a personal stake, and politically, he's got to get it right.
It's a lot of things that he has to get right then. Melinda, thank you so much for the context on the situation escalating in Ukraine. Melinda Haring is Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center.